Greetings, Business 310 students. At this point in the semester, you've had the chance to see each other's work a little bit and probably also participate in peer response, both as someone reading and reviewing and writing feedback for a peer, and also as a recipient of that same peer feedback. I'm also pretty sure that you've probably had some experience with peer response elsewhere, maybe in another writing class, in a job setting, or any other kind of place. In this video, I'd like to share a couple of thoughts about how you might be able to approach the peer review or peer response endeavor a little bit more productively. Oftentimes, students complain that they don't get a lot out of it, especially if they get feedback that's limited to things like nice job or this paper looks good. They can really help us feel good about the work, but ultimately the real question is it helping us become better communicators? And so that's the goal with all of this. I'll just jump right in and share a couple of thoughts. First of all, I think it's helpful to think, how is the experience working out for you so far? We all are going to be entering this class with different backgrounds and experience, and so we're going to approach peer response differently. Sometimes it might be difficult to read peer response, and sometimes it might be very challenging to think about really helpful and productive feedback for a classmate's writing. So here are some things that you can do. The one thing for the pitch perfect assignment to keep in mind is that it might feel a little bit different than providing feedback on a piece of writing. In some ways, this feedback is designed to specifically address the video component of pitch perfect. But I do think that the underlying principles here can really be applied to peer response throughout. For those of you that have maybe had class with me before, you might have seen this dichotomy in terms of the different types of feedback. But I really do think that effective peer response feedback really comes to this basic two-part understanding. So what's on the screen here is that there's generally two types of feedback that happen in peer response. Summative feedback on one hand and formative feedback on the other. And more often than not, students are actually most familiar with the summative kind of feedback. And the way I think of summative feedback, when something's summative, you're really kind of casting down the final judgment on something and saying this is great or this is not great. It's kind of like the final assessment on a piece of work. The real issue here with summative feedback is that, number one, it's actually pretty easy to give summative feedback, but the problem or the limitation is that it closes down conversation, and it's actually not very helpful in terms of pushing the writer or helping the writer to move a step forward with the revision process and try to improve. So I've got some examples here of really common types of summative feedback. The most common one I've read, and I know that I even write sometimes, is good job. Again, it sounds really nice, and we always like to hear that we're doing good job, but if we're trying to improve our writing, that kind of phrase, good job, doesn't really actually tell us much of what we can do. Another one, again, often these are positive. They come across like compliments. Your memo was really well written. It was really clear. These things are nice, but it's kind of an end-all judgment about something's being well written or it's not. So let's kind of think about that in contrast to this other type of feedback, which is really where I think the beneficial and helpful and what I would ultimately say are generative forms of peer feedback happen in this formative style. So I think of formative feedback, that word formative it's something that's developing. Maybe if you're a sculptor and you're working with clay, or you're a woodworker and you're working with wood, you're forming that substance into some beautiful pot or some beautiful piece of furniture. But along the way, you're forming it and shaping it. And it's that type of feedback that's really going to help a writer arrive at that sophisticated final product. So some features here of formative feedback, and then I'll give you some strategies for how you can produce formative feedback. First of all, the real goal is to provide information to the writer or the communicator that they can go on to use to develop or shape or form their next draft or their next version of the piece of communication that they're working on, whether it's written or perhaps as a video. A couple of really helpful strategies include are observations. You don't even have to say something looks nice or it's beautiful or it reads really elegantly. You can just say, as I'm reading through your paragraph, I get to the second sentence and I notice that it flows pretty smoothly for me as a reader. I really like how you used the semicolon effectively in that sentence. It's an observation and not so much of a judgment. If you do have a specific suggestion, you can share one. So again, maybe use the semicolon. You could say, I noticed in this sentence, you used a semicolon this way. I'm not exactly sure if that's the correct way to do so. Maybe check out this other example about how to use a semicolon with, a connecting conjunction if you want to be grammatical. But it doesn't have to be that detailed. You could also make observations like, I noticed that you have one very large paragraph. That might be an observation. A suggestion could be, have you thought about using more than one paragraph break to break up that very large paragraph into several smaller ones? And in that case, you've actually provided really helpful suggestions for the writer that they can keep working on. So those are some of the examples that I've got there. Here are some kind of formula statements if you want to use them that you could. So I see that you're trying to do something that you're observing here. If you want to kind of encourage them to keep going, you can say, what else do you have to say about that? I get the impression that you actually know there's some more details. What else would you say? A similar or related way to do it is you can say, hey, could you tell me a little bit more about this thing X that you've written about? It seems like there's more that you're thinking about. This kind of thing can be very helpful in a personal document like a cover letter or maybe even a pitch. Top right corner here, as I read this section of your work, I think what you're trying to say is, and then you explain your understanding of it, and then you just confirm with the author, is it correct? Here's what I think you're trying to say. Is my understanding correct? And that gives the author a chance to say, yes, I got it right. You understood what I wanted to say. Or they can say, actually, I meant something a little bit different. Let me change the wording on that a little bit. And then finally, in the bottom right corner of the screen here, there's a formulation that I think can be helpful if you're reading something or encountering something that is difficult. Maybe you just don't understand it or there's some confusing factors. Instead of calling it out and saying, hey, this section's really confusing, that would be an example of a summative comment. The formative version of the same paragraph, you could say, as I'm reading through your final paragraph, I'm a little bit confused in this section. I'm not sure, did you mean to say this one thing or did you mean to say this other thing or did you mean something else altogether? I'm just a little bit confused. Saying it that way gives the writer the chance to come back in, take up your feedback, and then respond in their own way and say, yes, you got it right, or no, I need to keep working this out and edit it a little bit. So as you're here for the Pitch Perfect, we'll say you'll get a chance to see a lot of different classmates' approaches to this topic. You can think about a couple of ways to anchor your formative feedback. One that works really well, take a look at the rubric that is attached to the final draft of the assignment, and then make comments that are attached or involve parts from the rubric. Another way you could do this might feel like a little bit more of a stretch, but if you go back to the first week of class, when we did these initial video introductions and had the skills grid where you identified the skills you're strong in and the skills you're trying to develop, you could also mention that as well. Offering comments in relation to these kind of common anchored points in a class or a workplace can be a really helpful way to take the focus off of making a judgment about the paper or the video or the author or the speaker, and instead making your comments be about the communication that the person's developing and how it is in relationship to the expectations of the class or of the other professional context. So finally, I'd like to just close this video out by pointing out that especially with the video, but in other kinds of communication as well, when you approach revisions, it's really an art of recognizing all the different possible ways you can make a particular point, all the different ways that you can communicate the meaning that you want to get across. There's always more than one way to say things or do things and get your point across. So the art is, number one, figuring out what are all of my alternatives, and then number two, being able to decide which one you want to use because you think that it will be most effective. So as you do that, the more options you have, the better. I realize that at the level of a first draft or developing your initial message, it can actually feel a little bit chaotic and a little bit overwhelming at times. But nonetheless, having more options rather than fewer will ultimately be to your advantage. So think through those options, think flexibly, and pick the option that you think will work best for you, and then put it to the test and see how your peers think about it in terms of the peer response and feedback that you receive.